Sure.
But I do believe that our liberations are tied together, are tethered to one another. And I think that that's a way to think about it, not only as a way of thinking about, well, will I fight for my sister or my sibling or my brethren, but what do I have to fight for? What kind of liberation am I seeking? And am I seeking the liberation of all?
Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
we know that, not to use like the language of colonization, we know that like liberation doesn't also come without sacrifice. So we know like on my way to freedom, like I may be lost or someone I love may be lost, as a part of that like kind of liberatory strategy. And we live with that. Like we're kind of existing and facing mortality at all times as we seek liberation out.
All right. Sevonna Brown, welcome. First off, am I saying your name correctly?
You are saying my name correctly. Thank God.
Hell
Thank you.
yeah.
Oh my God.
That's my first win of the day. That's good. Savannah, you are an exceptional human. You're doing a lot of work as a Black woman, as a Black doula, serving Black communities, predominantly, I presume.
Yeah.
Why don't we start with, I would have, I've already given your bio and your accolades and whatnot. I want to start with this little quote that I found on your website. Actually, I guess tell everybody just the one liner, what you want them to know about how you show up in the world and also where they can find you, because I'm going to be taking little snippets from your beautiful website so that they can go check it out themselves.
Amazing. Yeah. Thank you, Nathan. I'm privileged and honored to be in this conversation with you. I feel like our relationship is actually growing like through these like
My
collegiate
God, totally.
relations, but I also feel like we're in a commitment to be authentic and in integrity with each other and what each other does in the world. So I also appreciate you and just want to name that and say that.
Well, thank you.
Savannah Brown, you can find me as the national director at Black Women's Blueprint.
Oh,
So our website is actually restoreny.org. You can find more of my kind of personal commitments to the world and Black maternal health at savannahbrown.com and at Sanctuary Medicine on Instagram.
beautiful.
So those are some of the places you can locate me. I hope that if you're seeking and wayfinding in this work, that you will reach out to me because I'm in the business of building people's capacity to do this work with love and intentionality and integrity. The way that I show up in the work is through the commitments that I have to my ancestors. It's absolutely necessary to honor them and to think of them as I do my work. I know that I'm very much ancestrally rooted and grounded, and we kind of use the language of called to this work
I love that. Yeah.
spiritually. And in the times when it's like, why am I here? What am I doing here? That's what I turn to. Like I kneel at my altar, I connect to my ancestors, I say, what the fuck? Pray about it because it's really challenging
Yeah.
space that we're navigating. So I just preface this conversation with that understanding.
Yeah. I live in Louisville, and Breonna Taylor, her death was sort of reignited with
Mm,
what event was it? That it was right around COVID. It
yep.
was gosh, there was like basically we had a BLM movement rise out of Breonna Taylor's death. I can't believe I'm not remembering
George
George
Floyd, Breonna
Floyd.
Taylor.
And yeah, and a lot of our neighbors, a lot of Kentucky's very segregated. We live in a very white predominant area, and we would be open to living absolutely anywhere, but we had like 48 hours to find a house, and we landed in this beautiful neighborhood that just so
Wow.
happens to be on the outskirts of the city, but almost entirely white. And everybody had been writing up the names of Black victims of police brutality and violence and on their windows. And it was this really sort of, there was this movement happening. And of course, now there's a lot of controversy. People, on both sides kind of see the BLM movement as controversial. But and so I won't comment on that right now. But one thing that did come out of it for me was, how do we talk to Black women about Black issues? And that's coming from a place of like genuine earnestness. And even before we started recording, I asked you, do you want to be, referred to as an African American woman or a Black woman? So I do want to ask you about ancestors next, but explain to me, why do you prefer, and many women, Black women, prefer to be referred to as Black? Although I'm sure you're not super picky. If somebody were to use African American, you probably
Oh, sure. Yeah.
wouldn't
I mean, I
mind.
have
But
African American roots and I'm really proud of those roots.
yeah,
My people are from Missouri and Mississippi. So I have, my roots are in the South also, which comes with like its own heat, literally,
oh
right? Like
yeah,
just in terms of racial violence and racial tension, poverty, our great migration stories. I'm sitting in Michigan right now. So I'm living in Saginaw on Ojibwe bands. My ancestry here, linked and connected with indigenous peoples and women's blood as well, whose blood is in this land that I currently sit on. But I deeply resonate with Blackness because of its vastness, because it, to me, articulates that it is a diaspora. I know that while I have deep historical roots in the southern part of North America, that my ancestors also crossed over on the transatlantic slave trade, and Black women's bodies and reproductive labor was also exploited here in this country. And
yeah.
so when I think about my heritage, my ancestry, I regard my Blackness.
Mm,
There is obviously a political intent behind using African American, right? The hyphenated kind of moniker to describe our lived experience as well, because it does also pay ode and tribute to the transatlantic slave trade and the labor of our peoples. But black is me. Like
yeah.
Black is still, I was with somebody from Missouri this weekend and they were like, I'm Black as a mug. And they had a t-shirt on that said it. To me, it just has a vibration to it.
Sure.
It resonates with my community, with the populations that I'm from and a part of. And it also is a political context. So my family are Black Panthers also
No kidding.
in exile in Tanzania. So Black Power, Black Panthers is also a part of my kind of resounding word sound to describe myself and my life and my heritage as well. So I'm always centering Blackness in that way. So that's my personal political decision.
Yeah.
And if someone calls me African American, I'm just as extremely and remarkably proud of that lineage and that understanding as well.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you even fielding that question, because there is a sense, I don't know if you remember the book that came out right around George Floyd's murder. Let's call it what it is.
Yeah.
Um, there was a book by a white professor. Her name was Robin DeAngelis, and it was called White Fragility. Or was it
Yeah.
called White Fragility? Yeah, that's right. And I thought there was a lot of great points brought up, but it didn't really seem to quite capture it. And maybe it was partly because it wasn't written by a woman who has lived the Black experience. And
Yeah.
so I'm kind of curious. I've got so much I want to talk to you about, but I just interviewed Kemi Birthjoy Johnson a couple weeks ago, and she's lovely, a UK midwife, very very much like loud and proud, an advocate for not just owning your race, your creed, however
Mm.
it is that you show up in the world. It's also she also really is, I think. Like those things aside, she's just a great advocate for women. And I think a part of her platform is like, we have to get over color. And I may be putting words into her mouth, but she's sort of like, this is a plight for women. This isn't just a plight for Black women. And I think there was a little sentiment that was coming through with BLM, and maybe in a kind of a twisted way. So I wonder, when you're working as a Black woman for women, for Black women, I suspect, and you can correct me, but I suspect that you're also fighting for the plight of all women. Is that true?
Yeah. I mean, there's a quote that says, like, until Black women are free, none of us are free, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's
And yeah,
spot
and
on.
I wrestle with that quote because it makes me feel like a type of way. Like it makes me think like, well, are y'all only gonna fight for us if you think that it's gonna be a way,
Sure.
if it's gonna be a pathway or a vessel towards your own liberation? Like, or
Right.
can you love Black women un unabashedly, unapologetically, unendingly, even
Right.
without
Right.
your liberation being a piece of the collateral in that liberatory fight?
Right.
That's neither here nor there. I think, like in the conversation that we're saying right
Sure.
now.
Sure.
But I do believe that our liberations are tied together, are tethered to one another, and I think that that's a way to think about it. Not only as a way of thinking about, well, will I fight for my sister or my sibling or my brethren, but what do I like? What do I have to fight for? What kind of liberation am I seeking? And am I seeking the liberation of all?
Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
we know that, not to use like the language of colonization, we know that like liberation doesn't also come without sacrifice. So we know like on my way to freedom, like I may be lost or someone I love may be lost, as a part of that like kind of liberatory strategy. And we live with that. Like we're kind of existing and facing mortality at all times as we seek liberation out.
Yeah.
And, I feel like that's particularly evident and imminent right now when I think about Black maternal health and I think about the just immense casualties, like the lives that we can't get back, that have like kind of illuminated or awakened or pulled the veil back on the particular moment that are in terms of health, in terms of the healing that's needed in the community. And I find it actually incredibly and remarkably relevant that you mentioned Black Lives Matter as a context and also like as a backdrop,
Yeah.
to this moment, because it is a matter of reproductive justice. When we think
Mm.
about police violence and brutality, one of the tenets and the pillars of reproductive justice that 12 Black women coined in 1993, one of the tenets of those is like that we can like live in conditions that will like sustain our survival.
Yeah.
And right now, we don't have reproductive justice because the conditions that are actually that are meant to be built to sustain our safety are actually the ones that are threatening our lives, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And of course, there's an argument that those systems were never designed to keep us alive in the first place. But that to me just has me thinking about like, when those 12 Black women coined reproductive justice and they said, yes, the right to have a child or the right to not have a child or the right to have a child who gets to live in conditions that sustain and ensure their livelihood, I think that they were forecasting such a complex space and a complex moment that we're in right now that is not necessarily an abortion debate.
Yeah.
It's about sovereignty and dignity, living a life of sovereignty and
Right.
dignity, and holding systems feet to the fire around whether or not they are contributing to that or taking that away from us.
Mm.
Um, and so I think, I can say like for the tribe that I'm a part of, we're in deep investigation about whether or not we can depend on our systems to do so. And I can say like for the movement family and the political homes that I come from, we have shouted at the government until we're blue in the face about the fact that like we matter, our bodies matter, our lives matter, our children deserve dignity, that you should love the flesh of Black people, as Toni Morrison says in Beloved, right?
Yeah. Beautiful.
And we've done that till we're blue in the face without affirmation back from that system.
Yeah.
And so I sit at tables with people who are thinking not just about abolition, but also what the alternatives are after abolition, right? Like, what are we rooting up and growing out of the seeds that our ancestors planted, including many still living, those 12 Black women who coined reproductive justice and who are a part of a genealogy that says, like,
Yeah.
our lives matter deeply.
Yeah. Yeah. You brought up the word respect. I mean, there's just not a lot of respect from person to person nowadays. It's always like you need to have an angle there. There needs to be some sort of critical mass that turns people over to now caring about the lives of Black people. I personally kind of struggled with when I asked that. I'm realizing that the way that I asked that question before kind of pigeonholed you into saying yes, I care about all women's reproductive issues. But what I was really trying to get at, I guess, that if I could take that back, is that when people were saying, "Wait, all lives matter," it kind of came off as like a bit of like a dilutional process.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's all respect one another equally. And that actually kind of draws the energy a little bit away from the reality that
Yeah.
women are more likely to suffer great morbidities, even mortality in just having a baby, in the United
Mhm.
States, in a country that spends an outstanding amount of money on maternity care. And granted, yes, we're falling behind for white women as well. All women in the United States actually have a worse shot of making it through unscathed, childbirth. But the
Mhm.
fact that black women are maybe 2 to 3, up to maybe 5 times more likely to die, even though it's a low absolute risk, like that really should be something that we talk about. Like
Yeah.
very specifically, if you have more melanin in your, produced in your skin, that you actually have a worse shot. And it's because of all these myths that have been told. Even somebody very close to me once recently, actually, retired nurse of like 50 years. She said, well, black people do have thicker skin. I remember it was harder to inject, or
Wow.
start IVs and whatnot. It was like, God, like these myths are really, really damaging. And so it might be a couple more generations before we make
Yeah.
progress. But I would like to, it would be, I think it's helpful for all of us nowadays to think back to like the civil rights movement. And those movements were really, really critical in getting basic rights. But we actually haven't made much progress. Like there isn't that much progress, despite that being what,
It's
almost 70
devastating.
years ago. Yeah. So,
Yeah. And I challenge people. I so appreciate you kind of like walking that question back and like really wanting to be intentional about like, but can we say like black women deserve dignified like care and respect? Like, can we just say that? And can we
right.
be with the fact that yes, when black women are free, all people are free, but also black women. Right?
Right.
Like,
Right. Right. Right.
let's like actually be in a politic and in a mandate of centering black women and
Right.
centering blackness and naming the thing and calling it out. There is something I believe, and I also am deeply spiritual. So I also believe in the power of naming things and being extremely explicit about those needs. And I'm sure you would not be surprised how often I'm in a room with um, many doctors, MDs, OBs. It's up to you, Nathan, whether or not you call those your people. I know you have a whole different set of people that you
Savannah,
call your.
I'm in an identity crisis right now. I am the master of the chameleon. I can blend in with any crowd if it's going to lead to better care for the people
Yes.
I've taken an oath to care for. So that
I
doesn't
find
mean
that to be a tremendous, remarkable superpower, though, Nathan. And
it
and
it
I
really,
appreciate you for doing that,
yeah,
doing
yeah.
that level of work.
Yeah, and what I'm not saying is that when I'm in a room of like old crotchety white guys that I'm like, yeah, women,
No.
right? Like I can't do that, but I can blend in with them enough to maybe start to put like some feelers in there so they start
Yeah.
thinking about things differently. It's a
Yeah.
very hard line to walk. And I even was looking at the list of podcast guests that I've had like coming up to you, and I was gonna like I always like to say related episodes, and it was like, gosh, there's a lot of white people out there that have a lot to say. Like, where
Mhm.
are the black voices? Where are the Latino voices? Where are the indigenous voices? And so it's something I'm really pondering. Like, even in the podcast space in general, there's just not a lot of
Yeah.
insights coming directly from, the mouths of those people who we pretend to care about their justice, right? And so, and I say we, I mean the collectives of society when we say all lives matter. It's like, yeah, it's presumed we mean black women, but let's just call it what it is. Let's talk about the care of black women, and that's what we're going to do today. So,
Definitely. And I what I was gonna name is just like how challenging it is actually to get a lot of physicians, doctors, sometimes OBs to say black women. Like
mm,
to just utter like the words like black women or my black patients. Like, right? Like there's actually like a deep rhetorical challenge in the
you're
discourse
right.
of medicine to speak powerfully over the lives of Black women, to speak the care of Black women, to speak for the regard of Black women. And I'm not only talking about like those that blame like Black people for their own suffering, because we've seen a lot of that as well in medicine. Like, well, if only you would eat better, if only you would not smoke, if only you would stop doing drugs, if only you weren't born into a cycle of poverty, if only you had a different insurance type. We've seen that like kind of blaming on Black community in
Yeah.
medical racism and scientific racism. But I'm talking about the opposite of that, to actually like uplift, culturally affirm, um, revere Blackness, even, like, which is like my dream. Like, revere the sovereignty and dignity of Black women, see our bodies as sacred, see our health and well-being as sacred space, see my participation and my
Oh,
autonomy in my
yeah.
health and well-being as sacred space, see my medicine, my herbs, my witchcraft, my rituals, my ceremony as sacred and as to be revered and deeply regarded, right? Like, that's the like full other end of the spectrum
Mm.
that I'm constantly dreaming about, because I can't even get people to say, yeah, Black people deserve like amazing medical care, or like an amazing nurse, or someone who speaks their language when they walk in and they're in labor, right? I can't even get people to say that,
Yeah.
let alone to say like, I love Blackness, I love Black people, and I fight for the indisposability of that Blackness.
Mm.
That's what I dream of when I think about the kinds of allied work that I want to see in medical systems and healing systems, and co-conspirators who are seeking to create and be in deep, locked arms with Blackness and the
Yeah.
care of Black people.
And I don't know how people couldn't actually see that as relevant. Like so much of, if we want to call it American society, has been shaped, like very, very clearly, obviously shaped by the influences through the African diaspora. And unfortunately, most of that came through the transatlantic slave trade,
Yeah.
and the Caribbean in the generations to come. And of course, there is a very, very rich Black culture here. And of course, there's like, some, I don't know, hubris, or there's some stigmatization around embracing that, as white people in some regards, because it's like, that's not your culture. But everybody is a part of this melting pot. So without like diluting it too much, people forget that like something as simple as rock and roll, blues, like the musical influence alone, everything you're tapping your foot to, there's a good chance that was actually a beautiful contribution of
Mm-hmm.
the Black people that came here, not
Yeah.
against their will, nonetheless. But
Yeah.
so to imagine a world without people of color, if you just want this whitewashed world, that doesn't sound like any more beautiful a place as if we, than if we just had like this strict binary of man, woman, or straight, gay, or whatever else. All these like false binaries that we sort of hold so near and dear. So
Yeah.
that sounded like the whitest thing I've said in a long time, but
No, I have so much to say about what you just uplifted, which is that like, we have a problem loving and respecting and holding sacred Blackness, but we have no problem, and again, the greater we of society, we have no problem extracting from it. We have no problem
right,
violating it. We have
right,
no problem consuming it. We have no problem torturing it.
yeah,
We have no problem selling it and trafficking it and criminalizing it and incarcerating it. We have no problem with any of that. But our problem is with even the parts of it that has been given over or taken from
taken,
Black people,
more likely.
mostly taken. Even like macaroni and cheese, right? Like, this is a legacy of Thomas Jefferson's enslaved chef, right?
No
And
kidding.
rock and roll, the extraction of Black women's labor and Black women's spirituality. I mean, Rosetta Tharpe, who is the most incredible and influential rock and roll leader, was, communicating ancestrally when she
Yeah.
was sharing that music, and that was extracted,
Mm,
right? So there's no influence that we have historically in the historical record without violent extraction. We
right.
don't have an example of it.
Man,
um,
I don't think I have too many white supremacists that listen to my podcast, but if they are, their dinner was just ruined. That mac and cheese will never taste the same.
I mean, sincerely, right? And not only to say like how that has, how the world has benefited on the back and labor of Blackness, but also how Blackness has like suffered
Yeah.
horrendously,
Mm,
from those benefits, right? And obviously that's the definition of capitalism, but it just, to me, continues. I see it still, like I still see it like in my family, in my community, like when I'm sitting around the dinner table, like on holiday, like those sufferings are evident.
Mm.
like in my people, like in
Mm.
my grandmother's tongue, in the experience that I have if I like dare step foot into church because I need to go see my niece like perform a recital or something.
Right. That
Like,
witchcraft thing, you have
but
to lose that
exactly.
label for a minute.
Might have to hang that one up for a second just to like enjoy Sunday morning, but
Leave your witchy herbs at the door. Yeah.
yeah. Um, but also I will say, you just reminded me, I have such a remarkable and beautiful, great friend and colleague of mine, Ron Manigault Bryant, who writes Talking to the Dead, and she does an ethnography of 9 Gullah Geechee women who preserve their ancestral, medicines while also being leaders in Christocentric spaces in the United States and the Georgia Sea Islands. And she just talks about the deep necessity for their survival, their tactics, their strategies, and their creativity with reckoning with their God and what that God looks like and how that God has sustained their survival. And she shares just like remarkable stories of, their blending their root work with their more traditional Christian values, and also how that is an embarkment on of resistance for them. And so I say that to say, like, Blackness is also complex. Like, how could you not worship it? It is just so remarkable in the ways that it has sustained healing for communities worldwide, diasporically, right? And that's a part of my loving Blackness, is being in commitment and acknowledgement of those stories and of those ways,
Yeah.
those
Yeah.
ways. And that's why also I sit at the feet of Black midwives as frequently as possible to be utterly reminded of some of those life-giving strategies, those life-giving practices, those ways of ritualizing and ceremonializing and healing. And, I've learned the hard way to like not necessarily share what those are on platforms like this. I've like in my younger years of learning and witnessing things, I would like eagerly be like, did you know that this is how Black midwives either care for the placenta or do X, Y, and
Oh,
Z? And
yeah.
learned that a part of my reverence and my regard is to be in sacred preservation of what's been shared with me.
Mm.
So I won't go into explicit examples here, but those are the kinds of ways that I kind of center myself and ground myself in
Yeah.
this work, especially when we're in such challenging times, like around morbidity and mortality that we're sitting with and witnessing
Mm.
right now.
I think this is a great opportunity actually to very briefly, let's talk about ancestors for a second, because even the practice of birth keeping in the United States is not something that was started by J. Marion Sims, who, by the way, was
So
experimenting on Black women actually for a type of procedure that would fix what we call fistulae. No
yeah.
anesthesia. It was just sort of like, let's just use these, Black, folk healer or folk people, like it wasn't even like regarded as a part of our society. It was like, these people won't be missed. Um,
Oh, I have like tears in my eyes. I'm so upset.
it's a really shitty part of our history, I have to say. And
Yeah.
he's the father of gynecology, as if that label even fucking matters to anybody. That's not a label I would want to ever hold, because the sordid history of gynecology is going to be a big solo cast coming up in the future for me. I did one on the history of witches, women healers, and midwives, though. And it was it was a very Eurocentric lens that I was viewing it, because the witch hunts occurred for the most part for 3 or 4 centuries in Europe, at least the
Yep.
way that it was documented. There's witch hunts even happening nowadays in present day. I'm going to use the continent of Africa because
Oh
I don't,
yeah.
so I, anyways, but the reason I bring this whole thing up is that, a lot of people turn to the medical system ever since the early 20th century. Birth has moved indoors. The doctors, especially white men like me who wore white coats, now became the purveyors of safety and whatever, intervention, all of the things that now in the medical system they hold near and dear. But the ancestral lineage of midwifery dates way back, way, 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 way back, specifically to the continent of Africa. And I'm saying the continent, guys, because you have as many cultures in the continent of Africa as you probably do in the rest of the entire world combined. There is a variety of dialects, a variety of cultural practices, and midwifery traditionally has been honored as an apprenticeship, and it has been passed down through lineages. And it eventually arrived in the United States, again, thanks to the slave trade, so to speak. And now there is a very, very rich, let's say, to invest in the study of midwifery through what are now called grand midwives, these used to be called granny midwives, would provide you with such deep insights, not only into the practice of midwifery, but the history of how women were cared for in childbirth. So, as a doula, what are
Yeah,
some of your reflections? You've talked about connecting with your ancestors. Did you come from a lineage of Black women, African women, who were caring for women in childbirth?
certainly. Well, one who's living, she's 90. Black women in my life live long as hell. So I have a 90-year-old grandmother who was a labor and delivery technician in the South and the Jim Crow South. And, I
Mm.
could tell you stories, Nathan. Like, she wasn't allowed to touch anybody, as a Black woman because she's serving white women. But I think she had a particular like mysticism about her in which she she tells a story about how she always ended up in the elevator unattended with no doctor present. And almost every birth she encountered was a precipitous birth. And by the time they got upstairs, it was just like it was on and popping.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
I was like, I think that had something to do with my grandmother's strength, her spirituality, her knowledge, her wisdom, her knowing how the body should be shaped, how it should be held, how it should not be held, how to breathe, right? Her understanding of physiologic birth, her fearlessness, her understanding and deep reverence for the design of the woman's body, no matter what their race were, or even if they spat on her while she was supporting them.
That's a strong human, strong woman.
Yeah, I mean, this is a remarkable person who knows why they're on the earth and
Yeah.
is serving and in service of that purpose and of that mission. So that's one. And then you talk about the continent and the relationship between ancestral midwifery for Black women in the United States and the continent of Africa. I had the privilege of traveling through South Africa with Machilo Motse and visiting over 50 indigenous midwives who are from various districts and townships throughout South Africa. And, all of the work in South Africa around traditional midwifery, indigenous midwifery
Yeah.
specifically, is spiritually based. And so, in all of the conversations that I had, and all of the clinic based work that I had, and all of the community based work that I did with these midwives, one in particular, her name is Mary Manyeke, who just a fierce, incredible spirit. I was traveling with another midwife at the time, and she said, I can't proceed this conversation with you. She was saying this in her native tongue, and it was translated for me. She said, I can't proceed with this conversation with you until a midwife from your lineage tells me that,
Wow.
this conversation is ordained to happen and divine to happen. So we sat quietly as she asked permission, right? Which is a very deeply African tradition of asking for permission from the ancestors to proceed with the intent that we all say we're proceeding with.
Wow.
And for this, it was to learn, to understand, to exchange indigenous midwifery techniques between one another. And so she came back to myself and the other midwife, and she said, "You're good."
Wow.
And she's like, "There's two of them that I know are for you, and they're not for me." So I say that to say that there are
Mm.
ancestors in my legacy and my lineage and my genealogy whose names I don't know, right? And this is very typical of a Black African American experience that due to colonization, due to enslavement, due to the capturing and the rupturing of our relationship between the continent and our state domestic side living, there's just a lot of names I don't know. And there's a lot of seeking that I have to do, even spiritually, in the legacy and the tradition of midwife as a doula. So the answer is yes, there certainly are shoulders that I stand on, faces that I seek, wisdom that I seek in the work that I do. And, one of the midwives told me, because in the United States, it's so important to clarify the difference between a doula and a midwife. I just kept saying over and over again, I'm not a midwife, I'm not a midwife, I'm not a midwife. And one of the spiritual midwives looked at me and she said, you can't keep saying that because you exist in this legacy of midwifery, and it's deeply spiritual and deeply ancestral. And she said, you have to think of everything you do through midwifery. She said, even when you take out your trash when you get home, like stop denying this legacy, this inheritance, because it's irresponsible. So that was something for me to wrestle with and to reckon with. And just to be very clear, doulas do not in the United States do not have the same scope of practice as midwives do in the United States. But the conversation and the conviction that this midwife was bringing to me was around the spiritual relationship to my ancestors and my lineage and my legacy. And so she was offering to me to stand inside of the legacy of midwifery that I come from, even if I consider myself a doula as a full scope of practice. Just to connect the dots for folks who are listening and who are doulas. I wouldn't advise you to go around calling yourself a spiritual midwife or a midwife, especially if you haven't been counseled around that. But that is a part of my testimony and definitely a part of my kind of spiritual and clinical maturation in the work and legacy of midwifery.
What do you think about, I know you don't seem like the most judgy person, but what do you think about Ina May's book being known as, or being titled Spiritual Midwifery? Do you feel like there was a little bit of a hijacking of that term? I don't actually know where they got that term, but I'm kind of
Yeah,
curious.
I mean, I think unfortunately, again, back to the conversation that we were having earlier about not loving Blackness, but being okay extracting violently from it.
Mhm.
That's really where I land with that. And I don't want to like get in a interrogative debate about Ina May Gaskin's intentions, because white people have spirituality as well. I think something that's very misconceived all the time is like that there's a lack of culture and spiritual like boundlessness in whiteness. If y'all believe that, like, please go sit with your ancestors and do some work around that because that's not true.
Sure.
But what I would say is, in terms of the arc and legacy of what was taken from Black midwives, there is a critical conversation to be had there around how a lot of our practices, a lot of our assets, even our medicines as Black midwives, has been extracted from us, and we're demonized for it. But when other people do it, it's a beautiful like festival. And so I'm challenged with that, when I think about like an Ina May Gaskins or folks who kind of fall into that camp, because these are the tools and the medicines that Black women have gifted to this field and to this landscape. However, like our midwifery bags were taken from us. Like when we were doing that, that was very demonized and even heinously and wrongfully criminalized at times. So I wrestle with that. I grapple with that. I struggle with it. I think we're in such a trivial debate right now around like things like licensure and things like that, that we can't even really get at those kind of more egregious, I think, cultural
Amen.
imbalances and toxicities and diseases that we're actually wrestling across racially as midwives, because we're so distracted by like the big fights, the landscape fights.
Sure.
We're actually not like talking about those things as deeply. And I wanted to throw something back at you, Nathan. You brought up James Marion Sims, and if it's appropriate for me to ask you a question,
Please.
um, you when you were talking about him, and we talk about him all of the time as like this kind of like historical figure who like is just like positioned in a sketch or a painting, right? For one, James Marion Sims was not alone. He had co-conspirators
Yep.
who really, a cadre of other doctors who bared witness and who also, co-conspired in the violence and the dismemberment of Black enslaved women
And their babies.
and their babies, right? But one of the things I would ask you is, if I could see how a James Marion Sims could have used an abolitionist perspective. And, I think about like the many lives, the multi lives that we all live. And I'm curious, like, if you could have a conversation with him, like to actually literally go back in time, to like sit in front of him, to bear witness to whatever violence or greed he was like existing inside of or living inside of, um, what what would that conversation look like? And I wonder, you might have had conversations with a James Marion Sims, like in the contemporary landscape. I'm sure you've been in unfortunate debates and conversations with doctors, but I'm curious if one, you think an abolitionist intervention at the time would actually have changed the trajectory of things, given the influence that James Marion Sims
Yeah.
had.
Yeah.
And then two, like if you were in the position to intervene, what 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 do you believe that might have looked like?
I actually don't think that there would have been any intervention that even made sense to anybody back then. I think that what we have to consider, and the reason I haven't done this actually, originally with this podcast that you're on right now, I was going to do like a 10-part series on like these bad figures over the course of
Wow.
medical history, like OBGYN specific. And
Mm,
I decided not to because it is not fair to point a finger at that person who did the wrong thing. I do think that if I was in front of them and I felt the way that I do now, I would have a hard time keeping my mouth shut and I would say like, what the fuck is wrong with you? But we have to consider context. And I know that this rattles people's cages a little
so
bit. You know,
challenging.
like moral relativism comes in. And I'm not saying that for the times, hey, he didn't know. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that we had quite a dilemma, to say the very least, around our relationship as white people, as colonizers. Like that was our entire business. Let's command and conquer. And that has always been a part of US history. So, even nowadays, when people, I can go back to J. Marion Sims, but because I don't really know who he was, I don't really know who his co-conspirators were or whatever, it's actually very hard to say what an evil man that was. I actually think he was a part of a giant system that everybody was like, this is a great idea. So we should
Hmm.
really be upset with the system. And likewise, today, whenever people are like, I can't believe that doctor did this, let's take him down. I'm like, guys, we are all consumers of healthcare. We all go to the hospital. We all see these things. And especially as a physician, you see this shit happening every day. Not quite to the degree that Jane Marion Sims, did it, but I just told you that there was a person in who's close to me who 50 has been doing this for 50 years and still thinks that black people have thick skin.
Yeah.
Is that
Yeah.
an evil person? I know this person for sure is not an evil person. They are deeply spiritual, they're deeply loving and caring and compassionate, but they're a part of a greater cultural
Dissonance.
dissonance. Yeah,
Structure.
a structure that permits this type of shit to happen. I mean, we just saw the family in Texas who had their kiddo stripped away by CPS for
Yes.
very unclear reasons. It wasn't even like there are a lot of people who are like, "Yeah, that was the right thing to do." But we have a system that for some reason, the Swiss cheese model just let this slide through one door after another until this family was horrifically traumatized. And so the in summary, I guess what I'll say is it's very hard for me in the way that I think about things to see a single perpetrator as the bad guy, as opposed to a part of
Mm.
a larger issue at hand. And when we, I think, magnify it and just look at one person, Jamie and Sims, we miss the actual big picture, which is what you alluded to earlier. This is this is actually a quite deeper problem than licensure for midwives. There's a lot of horizontal violence amongst midwives, white midwives racist against black midwives. Like there is a lot of layers to this onion of reproductive justice for all the people, but especially for black women. So that's my long-winded sort of dodging around your question. But I would
Yeah,
like to think that I would take it to him, and all of his
of course.
co-conspirators. We all
Yeah,
think we're Captain America all of a sudden.
I know. I know. No, I appreciate you grappling with that with me in real time because I think about these things a lot. Like I think about, as a feminist and as also someone who comes from a highly traumatized like background and set of populations who are highly systemically traumatized. I also often think like, well, this is what I would have done. Like, or like our humanity, we are all victims in this patriarchal system. And sometimes
Right.
I sit with midwives who just like weep in my arms because they're like, I have to work in this fucking hospital and I have to like contribute to this system of and this set of violations that I know go completely against
Yeah.
what I know to be true.
Yeah.
And many of them will look at me and be like, I am the problem. I can't even have a conversation with you about like the problem and how we solve the problem when like 7 days out of the week, like I'm a part of that problem. And midwives that I deeply love and deeply trust that are trying to piece back together and do the, you know, again, to quote Toni Morrison, do the rememory work of reframing and recentering and regrounding themselves in the true values and the true politics and the true model of midwifery while situated inside of a greater system that's just like, yep, and after 24 hours, if the water's broken, then people have to go home or go to the OR, right? Like that's,
Yeah.
those are the structures that I think that we're not often talking about that we're situated in. And, you know, one of the things that I think has emerged, and I think naturally in a movement, just like we see in Black Lives Matter, when when the police kill someone, we are like that police officer is on trial.
That's right.
The whole
That's
damn
exactly right.
system isn't on
Right.
trial.
Right. Right.
That police officer is on trial. And when
And we want to say that that's justice, that that policeman got what it came to him. What about the other 8 million policemen who potentially could have done the same thing in the same
exactly,
circumstances because they're a product of mother culture, this milieu of influences that are not even really visible to us. Like they're so subconscious the way that we act, which is to give Robin DiAngelo some credit. That was one point that she made. Like, you have racist tendencies. It's okay. It's because you were raised in a white community and never saw a black person until you went to college. Like, it's okay.
yeah.
Acknowledge that. There was other parts of her book I didn't really like, but anyways, I digress. I'm totally with you there.
Yeah. And I feel the same way when we're like, okay, a Black woman died in the hospital. And now we're like, you, like the person who administered the epidural, the person who did the cesarean section, right? And while I believe deeply in accountability, especially if there's a track record of violence with an individual, there is also this holding the system accountable, right? Because otherwise, individuals who are part of that system just continue to be just as much a victim of that system. And I think we're uncomfortable with that right now. I think we're deeply uncomfortable with that because because there's a discourse of power involved,
Mm,
both with policing and with medical practitioners. There's a discourse of power. So we are not able to talk about systems without talking about people. And I think we're challenged by that. And I think we need to sit and deeply strategize and be intentional about how we think about structures of accountability, how we think about reconciliation and repair. And the reason I asked you the question about James Marion Sims is because there is so much historical repair that just hasn't been done.
yeah.
And I agree, pulling down statues is not the only way to do that. It's actually not the most holistic way to do that. And of course I believe that the spiritual intervention is needed, and I'm not ashamed to say that. But there are other
Me
forms, I
too.
think,
Me too, actually. Me too.
right? We need a revolution. Like, let's get out of here. So you know, I wrestle with these questions a lot in my work, and I don't like to sit and just have conversations in a vacuum without like really giving ourselves the honor of holding a larger conversation, even if all we have are questions.
Yeah. Oh man, Savannah, we're gonna have to do another interview because I want to get into that, this sort of spiritual, I hate to use the word awakening. It sounds so cliche. It's so like
Maybe,
vanilla.
but maybe.
But maybe, in some ways, a lot of people are like, let's burn the system down. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, you don't realize the system itself is the Leviathan. Like, you're talking about not just the hospitals, you're not just talking about the industry, like our corporations, big pharma. You're not just talking about our politicians and legislators, and you're not just talking about um like the people that are enforcing all of these policies. Like some people I've heard it called the medical military industrial complex. Like, this thing is a Leviathan. And so I used to think I'm going to change it from within. And not until I stepped out that I realized, hey, we can build a life raft over here to help sustain people in the meantime. And I kind of feel like that's your work is you're straddling both worlds as well. You're
Yeah.
trying to see systemic change, but you also realize that right now my boots on the ground are helpful in this moment with this woman giving birth, which is really where the spiritual midwifery piece actually I think is very therapeutic. see, and what I always say, I'm starting to sound like a broken record, but if we want to change any of these bigger systemic issues, we have to start with how we welcome babies into the world. Like if we can't get that right, in the respect and honor of any woman who's bringing life into the world, like if we can't get that right, I'm not sure we have much hope for anything, for
Yeah.
any of the injustice in the world. And this problem is not just a US issue. This is happening everywhere in the world. So I do want to spend a couple minutes, Savannah. I know you probably want, like, we could go on for an extra 4 hours, but I do want to give you, I want to spend a couple minutes just talking a little bit about this line that I got from your website, which is, again, we'll
Mm,
repeat it. I believe this came straight from restoreny.org. Sanctuary medicine is a cradling space for healing, dignity, and safety. And those are the three things that we've been talking about.
yeah.
What does healing what how do you frame this?
Mm,
Looking at the Black community at large, um, what healing is required? That's the first part of this final question. And then how can we dignify Black women regarding reproductive health and justice? And then also, why do Black women need safety? Why do they feel so unsafe? Is there a we've already kind of gotten into this, but looking at those three questions as a sort of amalgamated into this beautiful statement on your website, what, for somebody listening, what would you like them to know about what we can start doing in the immediate, but then also in the near future to start to shift things around, like the basic things?
yeah. If I could just start with safety and work back to healing, I
Please,
think
yeah.
the reason that Black women need safety or calling for a need to safety is because of, I think we started to talk today about just all of the external and I would say internal forces and factors at play
Yeah.
that are constantly threatening the safety of Black women in particular. And there's really not a location or a realm or a space or a person where Black women can feel completely safe,
Yeah.
like yet.
Mm-hmm.
And so that recalibration, even epigenetically, the seeking and need for safety, it requires obviously a social cultural rewiring.
Yeah.
And then on the individual level, it requires a neuroplastic, spiritual, psycho emotional rewiring.
Mm. So easy.
So let's do it tomorrow.
No, I'm only teasing because you are using like some of them like on the fringe. I don't mean that in a bad way. Like you are actually going there. Like we are talking about mind, body, spirit connection. We need a revolution of how
Yes.
we as a species show up in the world.
Yeah.
And I think that that is actually spot on. So I'm glad that you're leading the
Yeah.
charge. You're the vanguard. I'll be bringing up the cavalry from behind. I
So,
wrestle
I mean,
with it
if we
every
could
day.
just hold the complexity and the matrices of safety, that's one.
Yeah.
I think dignity for Black women has to be defined by Black women. And
Mm,
that's what I love about Black women.
mm,
Um, and I say that for every Black woman who is a church mother and every Black woman who's a sex worker. Like, she's got to tell us what dignity is to her. And none of us are one, none of us are the same. And our experience of dignity is currently informed by these kind of these systems, these factors, these forces that weather us. But I do believe that there's an afterlife to this violence wherein we actually get to dream the possibility of what our dignity is and gets to be held inside of our wildest possibility, not the
yeah.
possibilities against the backdrop of racism, sexism, misogyny, capitalism,
Mm,
imperialist
mhm,
violence, right? But one that is like our own.
mm.
And then what is required for healing? My God. I mean, I think
Just some
that
softball final questions here for you, Savannah.
like, okay. I mean, what is required for healing? I think, again, to me, it really does resound ancestrally. Like it has to be spiritual. It has to be ancestrally done. Reparations are required for healing, and to me, that also embodies the spiritual and the historical, cultural, emotional reparations that Black women are owed.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
then
it's not
there's
just like a check from Trump,
yeah,
whoever the president is, like, hey, here's your $1,200. Like,
yeah,
are we
no,
even now? Like, it doesn't really quite work like that. So,
no. And I believe in the material repair that Black women are owed, specifically in the United States,
yeah.
land reparations, right, as a part of the immense reproductive and productive labor that Black women contributed and that was extracted from Black women on this country. Land reparations are owed to those descendants, of
And that's
course.
actually extra complicated because we stole it from like a number of First Nations tribes as
Right.
well. And then
But
Black women
also,
and men were working it. So like it's whoever it belongs to, it's certainly not people that look like me, perhaps, through what you're saying. That's
right.
tricky.
But 90% of the land in the United States is owned by white people.
Oh yeah, and it'd probably be 100% when Bill Gates is done with it.
Seriously.
Billy Willie, I like to call him.
Oh my God, I didn't know that. I love it.
Oh, Billy Willie, just
Healing
causing
definitely
trouble.
requires repair, I guess is what I will have to say. And that repair is about the ruptures that have occurred, and that does include, our indigenous siblings.
Yeah.
Who my great colleague Farah Tanis is doing a very courageous project right now to transfer 300 acres of land back to indigenous and Black women, wherein they will co-steward that land together. And she says, when she sits with indigenous women as a Haitian American woman, she says, our afterbirth is in this land, right? The afterbirth of our ancestors is in this land. And so our repair is absolutely necessary for our healing. Once we can have land, we can grow fresh food. We can Montessori our children on that land. We can live safely. We can charter ourselves into freedom in the way that we seek to, right? And that is a part of our healing. That is a part of our divestment from those systems that impact our safety, that impact our dignity, that are currently, barricading us from our healing. So
Mm.
it won't happen overnight. But again, this is back to the conversation about what am I willing to give up on the way to liberation and on the way to freedom, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's those are the challenges that many of us are faced with in this deep work that we've been endowed.
Yeah. Ever since you started talking about land, I was thinking like what a perfect allegory for in some ways, um, in some ways, the allegory of our treatment of Mother Earth is actually a perfect representation of how we've treated Black women and Black men, which is this sort of extrication of, as you mentioned, of their labor, of their greatest assets, and then
Mm-hmm.
also simultaneously discarding them when we're done with it.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if there are any Black authors that have actually written about this sort of land debacle, because that actually
Mm-hmm.
is a really beautiful allegory. For me, personally, I don't think anybody owns the land. I actually think this is not
Right.
ours to own. And there are white people who, through our sort of capitalistic, intentions, have just stripped our beautiful planet of so many of its valuable resources, and just like kind of kicked it to the curb, so much so that we're going to like go to Mars now and just repopulate, and Earth,
Oh my
we're done with
gosh.
Earth now, but at the same time, if we have to if we have to have some sort of regulations over various bodies of land, how would our current day society look had we been a little bit more mm, respectful of this sort of land ownership thing? I mean, what if every slave had been given 100 acres of land and just cared for it in the way that even their ancestors had cared for it, as opposed to just this strictly, stripping, discarding process that we see across the entire United States, or really most of the world. So, anyways, you just got me thinking kind of in my heart
Mhm.
space about that. Um,
Yeah.
hmm. Savannah, I also want to acknowledge that you did not owe me an interview. You did not need to do this. You did not need to teach me about how to, honor some of these really important practices and traditions. And yet you did. You were very generous with your time today. And I have a lot of like love building up in my heart. There's a real genuine affection that I have, and you kind of being patient with my questions and really kind of flowing with me here. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Nathan. I mean, for the depth and for sincere, the sincere connection and the need for being in this conversation. Like it definitely felt like, even though I shit on church earlier, it definitely felt like church to me. Like it felt like kneeling at our humanity together.
The Church of the Goddess.
So thank you for kneeling at my humanity with me and allowing me to kneel at your humanity with you. I'm deeply appreciative. This was mutually serving. And I hope that our ancestors are happy that we've convened today.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I have a client who might be giving birth up in Michigan. Maybe I'll just pop a squat on your lawn for a few days and we can have coffee and tea and all those things.
Oh, yes, please. Thank you
Is
so much.
very, very much my pleasure, Savannah. We're going to do a part two because I want to go a little bit deeper on a couple of these topics. We didn't really even get into the reproductive justice piece, because you were in the business of birth control, featured in the film. Ricky Lake and Abby Epstein, good friends of mine and yours as well. We're going to link that in the show notes because it does give a little bit of the history. This is a sneak peek for part two into the reproductive justice movement in the United States, and the role of Planned Parenthood. And there's some eugenicists that were, happily trodden along in that whole program. I think it's a really important piece of our history, and I think that if we're going to even get to the healing and the dignity and whatnot, we have to be able to look at that really kind of twisted part of our history in order to try to maybe in the future make amends. So we'll explore all of that next time. How can people find you in the
Yeah.
meantime?
Please find me on Instagram. It's at Sevonna. I'm sure my name will be spelled in the podcast. At Sanctuary Medicine as well on Instagram. Please follow Black Women's Blueprints work at www.restoreny.org. And you can reach me directly at savannahbrown.com.
Savannah, if there's anything I can do to help support your missions, your initiatives, please, you know who to call. You got my cell phone, okay?
Thank you, Nathan. Thank you so much.